Hello and welcome to another episode of Our Own Devices with Nandagopal Rajan. No prizes for guessing who I am. But this time, again, a lot of new things to learn. And we're going to learn about, or at least discuss, because I'm not sure we can learn because it's such a cutting edge kind of a space. But we are going to discuss what's going to happen in the world of AI. We have all been talking about AI, the good things it's doing, also the jobs that it's going to take away. But the fact is we really don't know how it's going to pan out because things are changing so fast in the few months since ChatGPT 3 has been released. But the fact is that everybody is now thinking of what else to be aware of in this space, and that is who is going to regulate this sort of beast that we have unleashed. And to talk about that, we have with us Huzefa Tavawalla, who's the head of Disruptive Technologies Practice at Nishith Desai Associates, and his colleague Aniruddha Majumdar, both from the legal firm. So both of you, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having us, Nandagopal.
Yeah, thanks again.
So I'll start by asking a very generic question. And I was in a conference last week in New York, where, at least in the media space, this is one of the hot topics now. And we did speak to a lot of the big AI companies too in the process. But one thing nobody's sort of clear of is whether is this going to be self-regulation, or do you want a government regulation to come into this space?
No, I think excellent point, Nandagopal. And actually, we've been, tracking this space not only from an India perspective, but even from a global perspective. So from a global perspective, right now, if you see, the only formidable space from a regulatory environment is the European Union, and they have proposed certain EU directions which they intend to regulate AI and generative AI on a risk-based approach, from a high risk to, it gradually coming down. The US, from that matter of fact, there is nothing out there, but, as reports as recent as yesterday and day before yesterday, there are serious talks in terms of, coming out with a draft code. Very recently, as of yesterday, Japan has taken a very interesting segue in terms of how they look at regulating AI, and especially on the content which comes and which the AI trains on. So various countries are having different thoughts, but from a self-regulating as compared to the government stepping or intervening, it will have to be some sort of a balanced approach. And the reason why, Nandagopal, is that the technology is so broad-based that it is very difficult for everything to be kind of cornered, right? Because when you look at AI and generative AI, it's not only one touch point or one switch you switch on and switch off. There is a bucket of content which gets involved. There is accountability which gets involved. There's intellectual property rights which get involved. Privacy gets involved. So it needs to be looked at more holistically. And of course, if we have a broad-based regulation which comes in, which completely has bells and whistles, then of course the obvious threat is that will innovation kind of stifle up. So ultimately, the way and the progress which we have will need to be balanced. And just to kind of conclude from an India perspective, we don't have any federal law or a central law yet. There have been various talks. The Indian government has something called as body called as Indian AI, which is a strategy and working group of India, which is focusing on providing inputs to the government. There are working group reports which have been submitted. Niti Aayog has been quite active in terms of spelling out principles and organizational behaviors when it comes to responsible AI, but there is no particular law. And just to conclude, the last discussion, in public forum, there were some discussions in terms of the new Digital India Act, which is going to come into India. And some people say that, there could be some strokes in that, which may kind of touch base upon AI, but, too early days to kind of sum up any comments on that. So back to you, Nandagopal.
And as you mentioned, Europe is obviously going to have a regulatory approach, which is what it does for most of the things, right? America has and I heard this word being used in a conversation in New York last week. It's going to have a laissez-faire approach, like let's see how it pans out. And interestingly, you have the AI companies saying that, hey, maybe we don't know how to regulate this. Maybe we want the government to step in. This is also a sort of approach that some people are taking. But is it even regulatable? Like, this, because we really don't know where all this is going to go. We don't know the touch points, right? We can maybe regulate for what is happening now. 6 weeks later, the situation would have completely changed. So it's a very, so I guess there is no uh, early advantage here by doing regulation, right?
Correct.
So, okay,
And
sorry.
yeah, go ahead, Ani.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to what Huzefa was saying, right? So the biggest issue right now is the speed of innovation. So regulation has always lagged behind the speed of innovation, and uh, before the government even gets to know what exactly they are dealing with, the technology has changed, right? So in such a situation, it's actually a huge challenge to ensure that regulation keeps up the pace with how fast technology is evolving, and there is an arms race going on as far as the speed of technology is concerned, because every business wants to ensure that they are reaching, they are evolving technology at a pace which is faster than their competitors, right? So then it's an unending cycle that way. So in such a situation, the government is now thinking of a principles-based approach, which is basically not super prescriptive, which does not put out the details of what kind of provision should be there, what kind of compliances every business should take up, but basic principles like if so I think the European example is a good example where they have said that, okay, if there are situations where there are unacceptable risks, if the AI use case poses unacceptable risks such as threat to human safety or discrimination which is simply unacceptable, in such use cases AI will not be allowed. Similarly, they have basically made a spectrum. So after unacceptable, it's high risk use cases. So let's say if it's something like employment related decisions, if it's education related decisions, where in case the AI malfunctions or has some undesirable outcomes, the risk could be very high. So in those situations, the entities which are involved in those use cases would be required to have, as in comply with much more stricter obligations, right? As opposed to your normal chatbots, which are just being used for customer support, which do not really pose a very high risk. So in that sense, the EU is proposing a graded approach depending on the risk of the use case of the AI, not the particular AI technology itself, because the technology can change, as you said, within 6 weeks, within a month, within a year. But as long as those principles are in place and those principles can stand the test of time, that approach is currently the one which is being most talked about, I would say.
So it's almost like a ring fence, right? And to set the no-go zones, right? Like where you might need to have more of a approach where you maybe discuss with the government and get into that space before you do anything in places where there could be high risk. Is that right?
Right. So again, the use cases would be something which would need to be determined, that what exactly qualifies as unacceptable risk, what is high risk, and so on. But yeah, the idea is that certain avenues where there's absolutely no potential for any sort of compromise with respect to any malfunction, any undesirable outcomes, then that should be completely kept outside the purview of permitted use cases, unless and until the technology developers and the regulators clearly understand how to reduce or eliminate that risk.
So let's come to that point of how this is going to pan out in India. And you touched upon it to a certain extent, but the fact is that India has always been so slow with this kind of regulations, right? We still haven't got our regulation in place when it comes to the internet at large. So the fact that India is always so slow, then it's going to have a mixed approach to whatever it's learned from across the world. Is that going to help us in this case?
No, in fact, why we haven't even formalized the data law yet.
Yes, that's exactly.
Which we've been talking. I think the internet law, which is the DIA, is still yet to come, but we are kind of still grappling with formal data law. I think, Nandagopal, I think the approach has to be twofold, right? One is, basis what we just discussed, but you also need to understand that the way this technology works, and going back to what you said, it is very broad-based. The deployment can be right from the media industry to news to industrial deployment, to creativity. I think sky is the limit. And I'll give you a simple example, right? That how sectoral regulations will play an equally important role, is ultimately some form of, generative AI. The output is content, whether it is taking, just as an example, if you take ChatGPT, which is a text output.
Yeah.
If you take DALL-E, it is a image output,
Yeah.
artistic.
Yeah.
Similarly, if you take Jupyter and all that, there is a musical output.
Yeah.
Then there are lyrics. So there are video outputs. There are different sort of platforms where the output is different. Now, the first question, which kind of comes in from a sectoral perspective, and this is very nuanced, that a common user, when it is giving a prompt to the platform, in all these cases, which is the generative AI platform, right? It is just a prompt. Like say in ChatGPT, you will say write a essay on current affairs in relation to elections in India or US, whatever is your topic. Similarly, if you go to a DALL-E, you will say give me an image of a cute dog on the streets of Manhattan on a sunny day. For example, if you are onto the musical sites, a lyric site, you'll say give me lyrics like Adele or something like that, and then the output comes. Now the whole question for these sort of platforms, which is this sort of genre of generative AI, who owns the content which actually comes out, right, from the platform? Because platform, the way it is not, the moment you give the prompt, it already has a data set, not one data set, it's got like hundreds and thousands and probably millions of data sets on a real-time basis, basis how the platform is kind of tuned or programmed or wired. It kind of works, truncates, and it gives a certain output, right? I think the first question in these sort of platforms is that who will own the output which will come from the generative AI platform? Is it the guy or the lady who's giving the prompt? Is it the platform itself? Or more importantly, do some rights vest with the data set owners or data principal owners whose data has been scraped from the internet or whatever forms? Because one common fallacy which people don't realize is that if I have data, or for example I have a blog and I put in articles on my blog, or I have a site where I have my digital paintings or artworks published on the internet. The moment I publish it, it does not mean I have relinquished my rights.
Yes.
The moment it is in public domain, this is different from a privacy perspective. I think people get confused. This is my own work. Like, journalists, they have their blogs, artists have their blogs, they publish content out there. The moment I publish content, it does not give somebody else the right to, just go copy it, exploit it, and, reuse it on the guise that, oh, it's already published. So I think these are the fine lines. At a broad-based level is one approach, but ultimately, even from a sectoral perspective, and I'm taking IP as an example because it's the most relatable example.
Yeah.
That who will actually own the IP? Similarly, to wear another hat, right? What happens to intermediary liability from an AI perspective? Social platforms such as Google, Meta, Twitter, they kind of safe harbor basis saying that, look, we are not originating the content. We are just providing a platform whereby a user is uploading things or commenting things, or YouTube, or for that matter, and we are just facilitating. Now, will those rules actually apply to generative AI platforms? So I think it's fairly nuanced. It is, one is at a broader level, as you said, you have to look at it, but more importantly, depending upon the deployment, you will also need to have sectoral eyeballs looking at each vertical.
Also means that a lot of other conversations are happening, right? Like for instance, in case of IP, do you want do you give attribution to the original data set? For instance, like and this is a conversation I have heard, at least in the journalism space, quite a bit, and it is happening with some platforms. also the other very interesting approach is some people are saying that we will create the data set also on which it is trained, especially in the space of AI generated music, right? The data sets itself is generated by us so that we own the end-to-end copyright. So you have new kind of use cases also coming up, because especially in the music space, because you're maybe talking about litigation that runs into millions of dollars once you get sued.
Correct. Absolutely.
People are playing safe, right? So is this copyright thing that is maybe going to trigger a lot of the legal conversation around AI? Because I guess a lot of litigation is already happening across the world, right?
Yeah, in fact, there are, and Aniruddha, please chime in here. In fact, there are so many litigations, which are contemplated, and more so, in fact, currently in the US, there are a few landmark cases which are happening. We are awaiting judgments, which are specifically on the point which is going to determine that do data set owners have rights? What are the rights which are associated to a user? Which actually creates a certain work, and you need to understand the user which is creating take a musical work, or an artist take a painting or something. There is some contribution of the user because there could be a prompt and or some creativity in the lyrics, and there is some contribution from the machine. So how do you distinguish, right? How do you distinguish between the two? Is it joint ownership? Is it single ownership? So these sort of, we are hopeful that there is some jurisprudence, but also let me tell you that this jurisprudence is going to evolve because the technology itself is, so fluid. So something say, in June or in the next couple of months, we have a couple of landmark judgments which pave a certain way in terms of IP ownership on copyright. But let's also be sure that it is not going to be sacrosanct. It will evolve because this technology also is going to evolve. I'll take a pause, to Aniruddha for further inputs on this.
Sure. And I think what's also relevant here is that how the jurisprudence on copyright develops is relevant for the entire world, right? Because now any piece that is created in any country, how it is protected in another country is as relevant as how it's protected in its own domestic jurisdiction, because thanks to the internet, there are no boundaries for where a copyright can be exploited. So while for traditional works, we have the Berne Convention, we have a sort of agreement between countries that, all right, this is at least the base level which we will follow. The entire concept of generative AI has thrown out all of that, because now it's an entirely new ball game, right? Because earlier there was at least an agreement on human creativity. Now the question is, when AI is creating something, is there a human even involved? If the human is involved, to what degree are they involved? Should AI be considered as a person by itself in order to grant AI the copyright ownership over the works that it creates? And on top of that, all of these generative AI applications, if we look at their terms of service, even they take a different approach. Some may assign the work to you, some may say that no, we own the work ourselves, some may say that no, you own the work as long as you comply with XYZ. So it's a very interesting space, but regardless of how the jurisprudence evolves in each country, there would need to be consensus across the globe, at least to a base level, because otherwise it will all be a very chaotic affair. Because just because something, if UK takes an approach which is different from India's approach, then who do the developers go to, or which approach do they take for their own policies and their own business decisions, right? So I feel these are very interesting questions, but they will need to be resolved sooner or later.
Other question I wanted to ask about is around jobs. And a hot topic across the world, will AI take away jobs? I was speaking to a couple of companies from Scandinavia where they're very bullish about what AI can do in a market like theirs, where human resource is not available, and when available is very expensive, right? So AI is, of course, the cheaper alternative to go to, and a lot of these companies have already moved to a AI-driven approach with a lot of stuff that they do. But the situation is maybe completely opposite in a country like India, where human resource is still maybe cheaper than AI. It is available, and we really don't want to bring in AI into places, even if it's cheaper, because we have a obligation as a country to maybe provide more jobs. So how does that happen? Like, do you think, each country is going to have a very different approach given their economic situation? Like, will the human interest, even be a factor when you look at something like this?
Yeah, it's not one size jacket fitting all, right, Nandagopal? That ultimately each one would view it differently. Like, for example, the Scandinavian example which you gave, where the population itself is truncated, manpower is less, something like that is more than welcome. When you look at India, right, you also need to understand it's not so at an overall population level. A lot of our population is still in rural India. It's not so urbanized, right? Close to 65 to 70% of our population is still in rural area, where in general technology penetration is less. It's not so high. Like even in India today, automation is there. The industrial revolutions have actually unfolded over a period of time, but even today, automation has penetrated only certain sectors, right? A large number of our population is still not so tech savvy, or is not heavily reliant on technology and these sort of tools. So yes, one side of the coin is that upskilling is a natural phenomenon which will have to happen, and people will get more and more upskilled. But I think for a country like ours, the important touch point is that to what extent any which way has technology penetrated. So if technology in general has penetrated, which is where use cases associated with AI can be deployed. But at a call level, if it's not yet deployed, it has not yet penetrated, then even this sort of it will not have a market as compared to some other country. So, it would need to be just viewed in that perspective.
So if I can wind up by asking one last question, AI is also going into a lot of spaces which had like maybe heavy regulation, and I once spoke to this company, which is in the space of pharma, where testing which would have taken maybe years is sort of expedited because AI starts negating a lot of negative use cases, or or possibilities that you don't really have to look at, that is automatically negated by AI, so that you start focusing, which brings the time taken to create a new drug, which shortens the time taken to create a new drug. But it also goes against the kind of traditional legal look at a lot of these spaces, right? So how is that going to evolve? Because we're talking about AI at a macro level, but then you need to have maybe very different approaches happening for a lot of the specific segments, right?
Yeah, that goes back to the point on sectoral, right? As I said, that at a broader level is one, but at a sectoral level, taking IP for that, we just discussed this entire sectoral point on a IP perspective. Same way when you're looking at why pharma industry, when you look at the software industry, right? People are using these platforms for coding, so a certain sort of efficacy which leads to a faster and a better output, which is computer generated, is going to continue. I don't think we can shy away from the point that in today's times and going forward, output from a computer is going to get reduced. Computer, I mean, I'm using the broader word, I mean, platforms such as these, it's only going to enhance. So I think the question which needs to be asked is, one is the rights and all of that, which we've discussed, but I think the more broader question which needs to be also thought through, and this is also doing the rounds internationally, is where do you draw the accountability of a machine or a output of a machine output? Because you need to understand that people who have created these platforms, right, let's give them the benefit of doubt that they have been created for the good. I think at a starting point, nobody has devised this entire ecosystem for an evil purpose. Yes, it could be used for a devious purpose, but the whole point is that when you put something out there, which is AI, it learns on its own. At a very basic level, it depends on what data is fed into it. It's like a goblin, right? It keeps feeding, feeding, and then there is a certain output. Now, 9 out of 10 times it is so going to happen is that in the future, people may rely on that output more and more, So the whole point which you step back and say that, what is the accountability or veracity of that output?
Yeah.
So the theme, the underlying theme to all of this is, and which is what my colleague Aniruddha had touched upon, is responsible AI. That the outcome, can it be kind of explainable, which our principles call as XAI or XI. It has to be explainable, right? So at least the output you can determine in your medical example. If there is a certain efficacy, yes, you may realize from A to Z, you moved A to Z, and Z, we assume it to be, correct. But what about the journey of B, C, D, E, F, G, right? There has to be a journey which has to actually prove that Z is the right way. So I think responsibility and accountability is a slightly broader question, which will segue, into the future. A very important point to segue into the future.
Aniruddha, you want to add on that to close?
Sure. So the thing is, as you said, right, for sectoral use cases, one, of course, is what is the AI being used for? It's not that AI is an industry-specific technology. It can be used across industries, and even the government is aware of that, because different ministries, for example, MeitY has had its committees on AI submitting reports on mapping technologies, submitting reports on cybersecurity. The Telecom Regulatory Authority of India had issued a consultation paper last year on use of AI in the telecom sector and how much the telecom infrastructure is required for deploying AI. So every sector, I feel, is conscious to a certain level that AI is coming. The government is also aware of that. The developers, of course, they have their own, objectives. They would also want to ensure that the technology that they are building is deployed as widely as possible. So I feel these are things that will have to evolve with time, because as of now, although a lot of AI has developed, AI has developed a lot, it's still not reached that level where every sector already knows what is going to happen. It's still early days, especially with generative AI. I think the conversation only started maybe middle of last year in India. So, and a lot of things keep coming every day on the news, right? Like, for example, recently there was this news where a lawyer in the US used AI to prepare a brief before the court. But the AI actually threw up imaginary cases which did not exist. And once the lawyer was quizzed, they realized that, all right, these are actually fake cases. And that is because the AI was not trained on legal data, right?
Yeah.
So situations such as these, right, when
hallucinations,
right? So gradually, when such situations come up, not just hallucinations, but maybe some kind of biased decisions, let's say, on part of the AI or some other issue, basically. So I think we will learn with our experience. It's not that today we can find a solution to every sort of possibility that AI will come up with, and each sector will have their own priorities, and that's how things will evolve. I mean, it's vague, but I feel that's the best conclusion I can give for today.
Interestingly, based on that, I heard somebody say recently, like, if you use AI, for instance, to create news, you will actually end up needing more editors, because everything will have to be now double checked, right? Like, the fact that, so, and maybe even in the legal space, you will need to have every instance to be, double checked, and maybe you'll actually need more lawyers if AI is going to get involved. On that note,
I think one point, to conclude, and we joke on a lighter vein, we joke about it internally, that human content going forward could be very, very valuable. You know why?
Yes.
Because it's going to be rare.
Yeah. So, you charge a premium because it's handcrafted.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah. So thanks a lot for being on the show, and a lot of insight, into an evolving space. And maybe we need to come back again 6 months later to have a relook at what we discussed and what actually happened and what is maybe going to happen at that point of time. So thanks a lot, Aniruddha and Huzefa, for being on the show.
Thank you for having us. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks. It was a pleasure.
So you are listening to Our Own Devices. We'll be back again next week with other guests. Till then, our podcast is available everywhere you listen to your podcasts.